ragtag bunch gone out and saved the day. But unfortunately for Hollywood executives everywhere, that's not the way it went. When Theodosius finally led his army out into battle in 380, the hope, of course, was that he was leading them out to avenge Adrianople and crush the barbarians. But it was not to be. And this is even after the Goths helped the Romans out by having the Greuthungi and the Tervingi decide to go their separate ways earlier in the year, leaving Theodosius with a much less daunting task ahead of him. Citing the fact that there was not enough food around to feed them all, the Greuthungi decided to head northwest, where they were eventually crushed by a western army guarding the Illyrian frontier. This left Theodosius with only Fritigern and the Tervingi to deal with. But when the two sides met in battle at some unknown point later in 380, the Goths once again won the day. The sources point to some unknown bit of treachery just before the battle, possibly the defection of some of those barbarian auxiliaries, but all other details have been lost to history. However, despite the Roman defeat, Theodosius made sure that it was not another Adrianople, and the new emperor extracted his army from the fray before things got out of hand. From that moment on, Theodosius' strategy for winning the war changed completely. He no longer believed that he could deliver the kind of outright military victory that he was expected to win, and so he focused all his energy on reaching a peace agreement that would be acceptable to both sides. After 3 years of wandering aimlessly trying to feed themselves on ever-diminishing spoils of war, Theodosius was betting that the Goths were probably getting as ready for a settlement as he was. In January of 381, the emperor was gifted an opportunity to demonstrate his honorable intentions when Athanaric, the old enemy of Rome who had sworn never to set foot in the empire, arrived at the Danube with what remained of his people, begging for asylum. The old Gothic king was sick and dying, and after years of hiding out in the Carpathian Mountains hounded by the Huns, he finally decided enough was enough. He wanted to die in peace, and Theodosius jumped at the chance to give him the opportunity. He welcomed Athanaric into Constantinople, which the emperor himself had only set foot in for the first time just 3 months before, and he treated the Gothic king like, well, a king. And when Athanaric died of his illness 2 weeks later, Theodosius gave him a state. The message Theodosius was hoping to send to Fritigern's people was clear. Romans and Goths are much better served when they are friends, not enemies. If you give me a chance, I am prepared to treat you as well as I have just treated Athanaric and his people. To the outlaw Goths still out in the Roman countryside, this was a message they were willing to hear. But it would still be another year and a half before the war officially came to an end. Throughout that end phase, perpetuating the stalemate became Theodosius' sole military objective. Keeping the city supplied, making sure they could continue to hold out, and never risking an open battle. By the autumn of 382, trapped in a cycle of diminishing returns and perpetual insecurity, the Goths were finally ready to deal. The terms agreed to by the Romans and the Goths were, as I said, the true essence of why Adrianople was such a big deal. The agreement wound up being pretty simple. The Goths would put away their swords if the Romans allowed them to settle within the empire. But critically, the rulebook governing how barbarians were to be settled within the empire was thrown out, and a whole new book was written on the spot. The particular details are lost, but the big overarching themes are visible. For example, the Goths were not broken up and scattered into small settlements, but instead allowed to live together in a large group. This of course meant that at all times they had to be seen as a potential military threat, but it also meant that they were better able to maintain their own separate Gothic identities. That is not good. On top of that, the Romans agreed to recognize Gothic leaders and bargain with those leaders when they wanted something out of the Goths. So that whole breaking of the tribal power structure thing that had been the foundation of how the Romans handled barbarian resettlement was now tossed out. In its place, that whole tribal power structure was allowed to persist. This is also not good. Although I will mention here that somewhere along the line, Fritigern magically vanishes from the historical record. No one knows if he died in battle or if he was overthrown by his war-weary people, but there is some speculation that his ouster may have been one of the Roman conditions for peace. You know, we'll deal with your leaders, that's fine, but we won't deal with that leader. Perhaps it was a teensy tiny measure of revenge for Adrianople. Finally, though many of the settled Goths wound up joining the Roman army as individuals, both sides agreed that if the emperor deemed it necessary, he would be allowed to call on the Gothic nation as a whole to come fight for Rome. However, they would not be required to fight under Roman officers. Instead, they would be allowed to fight in their own way under their own leaders. Basically, they would be nothing more than an emergency auxiliary force serving next to the legions, rather than being a group of Roman citizens serving in the legions. All of this boiled down to the same thing. The Goths were not going to become integrated members of the empire. Instead, they were going to continue on as a foreign nation, who just happened to be living on Roman soil. To say that this was a break with precedent is the understatement of the millennium. Romanization of their enemies had been like the overriding goal of Roman foreign policy going back I don't even know how far, maybe forever. That overriding goal was now kaput. Backed up against the wall, bargaining from a weak position, and desperate just to get the Goths to go to bed, Theodosius chose to deal with them not as mighty empire and puny mortal, but as just another flawed and vulnerable nation trying to secure a peace with just another flawed and vulnerable nation. The ripple effect of this choice would be felt for the next century, and yes, proved to be yet another one of the 257 different reasons why the Western Roman Empire fell apart. But the Roman Empire is not done yet, and next week will be a time of much rejoicing. The 5-year-long Gothic reign of terror was at an end, and things could finally go back to normal. Theodosius, Gratian, and the rest of the Romans were allowed to bask in the glow of this quasi-victory for almost a whole year, before, on the complete other side of the world, yet another massive threat to the stability of the empire would pop up. This threat would also lead to the death of an emperor, although instead of coming from outside the empire, this one would come from within. So, at least it was a nice change of pace. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 155, The New Bishop of Milan. Last time, we left off with the Empire ever so temporarily at peace. The Sassanids had made no sudden moves while Theodosius had been occupied with the Goths, and the Germans of the Rhine frontier had been laying low since Gratian had swooped in and bopped the Alemanni in the head right before the Battle of Adrianople. For the briefest of moments, the Roman Empire was free from the burden of armed conflict. But sadly, it was inevitable that somebody, somewhere was going to be unable to handle the sheer tranquility of it all and snap. And indeed, it took somewhere and snapped. That somebody? a senior general named Magnus Maximus, who was the highest-ranking officer on the island of Britain. Seizing the opportunity that quiet frontiers and dissatisfaction with the Western Augustus Gratian provided, Maximus stormed down off Britannia in 383 and lit a big new fire where just moments before it looked like the coals were about to finally burn themselves out. Such is life. There's not much to go on about why Maximus decided to suddenly revolt in 383. All we have to go on is vague hints that Gratian was not popular with the soldiers, and that the Roman occupation of Britain was in bad shape morale-wise. To take the last part first, it had been a good 15 years since the Great Barbarian Invasion had nearly knocked the Romans off the island for good. If you'll recall, far from busting their humps fighting the barbarians off, disgruntled legionaries had actually joined in the plundering. You'll recall that when he arrived to take hold of the situation, Theodosius the Elder had been forced to rely on some pretty serious clemency to get the wayward troops back in their barracks. In the decade that followed, Britain was calm, but it does not appear that any of the underlying issues that had led all those soldiers to so readily switch their allegiance had been addressed. The bottom line was that serving on the island was an unglamorous gig with almost no opportunities for glory or enrichment. Though, yes, one does wonder if the British soldiers would have preferred getting annihilated at Adrianople. The more immediate motivation for the revolt, though, was a specific dissatisfaction with Gratian. We've already touched on the fact that the now 24-year-old emperor had never been a soldier's soldier, and that his father had intentionally kept him out of the camps as a young man so that the soldiers wouldn't notice just how not a soldier's soldier the future emperor was. But now that Gratian was emperor, it was hard not to notice that he really wasn't one of them. I would like to point out, though, that it's not like he was a disaster or anything. He had, after all, delivered an impressive victory over the Alemanni in early 378. So this was not so much a matter of failure undermining his authority, as it was temperament undermining his authority. Gratian, and can you blame him, preferred the luxuries and comforts of civilian life to the rough hardships of military life. From grunt to general, then, the soldiers never really formed a bond with Gratian. And so, when it came time to defend him or overthrow him, well, as we will see, Gratian died alone. The last specific detail we have about why the troops disliked the emperor was the fact that Gratian seemed to favor his elite Elan bodyguard at the expense of everyone else. In a story reminiscent of Constance and his archers, so reminiscent in fact that I wonder which, if either, story is actually true, Gratian appears to have grown so enamored with his Elan guards that on top of lavishing them with wealth and honors, he took to acting like them and dressing like them. Now, the troops up in Britain never would have witnessed this firsthand, but disgruntled stories would have been passed around and done their dirty work to undermine Gratian's reputation anyway. I think the real impact of this favoritism, though, was most likely felt as Maximus's army was approaching Paris. The troops nearest Gratian would have seen it all for themselves, and so when it came time to fight or desert, they decided to desert. After all, if the Elan bodyguard is so awesome, well, let them protect the emperor.